Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Tonight, we're heading into the heart of California, a state known for its sun-kissed beaches and sprawling cities. But beneath the surface, there's a darkness that few dare to speak of. From mysterious disappearances in the wildest deserts to strange creatures lurking beneath city streets, get ready for 5 of the most disturbing true California horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing. And by doing so, they miss out on the creepiest, spine-tingling tales that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because tonight's just the beginning, and the terror waiting in the darkness is far from over. So, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments, because here, the night is only getting started and the horror is waiting to unfold. Now, let's dive into the darkness. I moved back to Bodega Bay the year I turned 63. Not because I wanted to. No one really wants to come back here, not after what happened. But because I couldn't stay away anymore. Too many dreams, too many questions. Too many nights staring at the ceiling and wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was something more to what took my boy. My name's Martin Hale. I used to be a marine biologist, professor at UC Berkeley. I spent 30 years studying tide patterns, deep-sea organisms, strange migrations. But none of that prepared me for what I found in those damn tide pools. None of that prepared me for Ethan, my son. My only child. He drowned in the bay when he was just 15. We were on a weekend trip, something simple, something fun. A father-son bonding thing. He said he wanted to take pictures of the crabs and sea stars during low tide. It was foggy that day, thick as wet cotton, and the tide was turning faster than I'd ever seen. I blinked. He was there. I blinked again. He was gone. They never found his body. That was 20 years ago. I bought a small cottage near the cliffs, the same coastline where Ethan vanished. From the front window, I could see the fog rolling in every night like a living thing, slithering across the water, curling around rocks like fingers. It wasn't like normal fog. This stuff moved with purpose, and it always came in at exactly 3:12 a.m. every damn night. Like clockwork. I started tracking the tides again, recording the shifts. And something was wrong. The patterns didn't line up with any known charts. The water would pull back, and tide pools appeared in places they shouldn't. Deep, circular holes in the rock filled with water that glowed faintly blue under moonlight. And in those pools, things stared back. Not fish, not crabs. Eyes. Big, barnacle-crusted eyes that blinked slowly, as if they'd been asleep a long, long time. The first time I heard his voice, I thought I was losing it. It came from the fog outside my window. "Dad!" I nearly dropped my mug. I rushed to the door and flung it open. The fog was thick and still and heavy. There was no one there, but I could hear the splash of bare feet walking across wet stone. And then, the tide pool at the base of the cliff began to glow. I walked out barefoot. The rocks were slick and cold. My breath felt sharp in my throat. He rose from the water like he'd been waiting. It was Ethan. My Ethan. Same face, same eyes. But something was wrong. His skin was pale, almost see-through. His arms were too long. His lips didn't move when he spoke. But he did speak, not in English, in a language I recognized but didn't want to admit I knew. A guttural, clicking tongue I'd seen scribbled in a forbidden text once, deep in the archives at Berkeley. The Codex Salarius, a 14th century manuscript found in a lead chest off the coast of Portugal. It spoke of tidal gods, deep dwellers, and the offspring of the fog. I never told anyone I translated part of it. But Ethan was speaking it perfectly. He said one word that night, one that chilled my bones. Return. And then he was gone, slipped back into the pool like a shadow into ink. The next morning, I found seaweed in my bed. My hands smelled like salt. My feet were wet. I hadn't dreamed it. Over the next week, I watched the tide pools. They opened like mouths. Bubbles rose, carrying a smell I can only describe as ancient, like rotted wood, salt, and something alive. I heard chanting from beneath the waves. I followed the fog to a cave hidden in the cliffside, only visible during those unnatural low tides. Inside were carvings, spirals, eyes, teeth, and in the back, etched into the stone wall, the same word over and over again in that forbidden tongue. Return, return, return. I was never meant to escape this place. Ethan was never taken. He was chosen. Tonight is my last night in this world, I think. The fog is thicker than ever. The tide has receded farther than I've ever seen. The pools are open wide, and I can see dozens, no, hundreds, of glowing eyes watching me from the depths. I hear voices outside. My son is calling me again. He wants me to come home, and I will. Because in the end, the fog doesn't just take. It calls back what belongs to it. There's something wrong with the Winchester house. That's not exactly news. It's kind of the whole point, right? Tourists come for the haunted vibe, the staircases that lead to nowhere, the doors that open into brick walls. They pay for the weirdness. They love the story of Sarah Winchester building room after room to confuse the ghosts of those killed by her husband's rifles. But what they don't know, what they're not supposed to know, is that the house wasn't built to trap ghosts. It was built to keep something out. The guy's name was Daniel Ortiz, 45 years old, big hands, hard worker, 2 kids, no drugs, no record, just a blue-collar guy with a toolbox and a job to do. I was managing the crew during that winter renovation project, sealing up some of the back rooms and replacing old supports that had rotted. The house has about 160 rooms, give or take. Honestly, I've worked there 5 times, and I still get turned around inside. It's like the walls shift when you're not looking. We were working in a wing no one had touched in decades. The place smelled like dust and rotted wood, and something else, something sour, metallic, like an old penny in your mouth. Daniel was the one who found the sealed chamber. It wasn't on any blueprint. No one even knew it was there. We were taking out a false wall when he found it, a narrow doorway, boarded up from the inside. Strange thing was, the nails were ancient, square-headed, rusted, but not like they'd been exposed to air, more like they'd been preserved. Daniel was the first one to go in. I remember him standing in the doorway with his flashlight, not saying a word, just staring into the dark. He stepped inside. That was the last time we saw him for 3 days. We searched the entire house, called the cops, checked every camera, every room. Nothing. It was like he vanished into thin air. And then, on the 4th morning, he came back. He walked out of the front door at 5:33 a.m., barefoot, shaking, covered in dust and cobwebs. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and there were deep scratches all along his arms. Not self-inflicted. They were too straight, too patterned. He wouldn't talk, just kept mumbling something under his breath, over and over. Angles, the wrong kind. They curve inward, but not in space, in thought. They live in thought. They took him to the hospital. He didn't fight it. He looked relieved, actually. That night, I snuck into the room he'd disappeared into. I couldn't help myself. Something about it pulled at me. Inside, the air felt thick, like walking into water. There were symbols scratched into the floor, not drawn, but scraped deep into the wood, like with a knife or a claw. Circles inside squares, spirals that folded in on themselves until they were just a dot. And in the center of the room, a small door in the floor, about 2 feet wide, bolted shut with rusted iron braces. It throbbed. That's the only way I can describe it, like the wood itself had a heartbeat. Daniel escaped the hospital the next morning. They found him 2 days later in a motel outside San Jose. He had scrawled hundreds of symbols on the walls, using a mix of charcoal and his own blood. The floor was covered in notebook pages, some torn, some taped together, all in the same spiraling handwriting. I read some of it. He talked about nameless architects, beings that came from beneath the earth before the first humans spoke a word. Things that built cities under San Jose, places with no geometry that made sense. They didn't live in time like we do. They lived in angles, and thoughts, and vibrations. He said Sarah Winchester wasn't building the house to confuse ghosts. She was trying to build a lock, a spiritual firewall, to keep them out. Daniel's last journal page wasn't finished. It started normally, but the writing began to spiral, curling into itself, tighter and tighter, until the words weren't words anymore. Just loops, like a fractal folding into a black hole. He was found dead in the motel bathroom. No wounds, no trauma, just gone. Face frozen in terror. They sealed off the room again, bricked it up, pretended it never existed. Tour guides still tell stories of Sarah and her ghosts. They sell keychains, plastic skulls, haunted house t-shirts. But none of them talk about what's under the floorboards. Sometimes, at night, when the wind hits the house just right, you can hear the whispers. Not loud, not clear. But if you're stupid enough to press your ear to the wall, you'll hear them. They don't sound like ghosts. They sound like things remembering what they were before we were ever born. Was 26 when I went out into Death Valley alone. At that age, you still think you're smarter than the world, braver than the ghosts, and stronger than the myths. I was in grad school at UC Davis, grinding through my thesis in geophysics, desperately trying to prove I could uncover something new, something no one else had dared to look for. My research focused on ancient volcanic impact zones, specifically Mar craters, and there's none more infamous than Ubehebe. Ubehebe sits like a scar on the northern edge of Death Valley, a deep, jagged hole almost half a mile wide and 600 feet deep. But I wasn't just interested in the shape of the land. I wanted to find out what was beneath it. Subsurface readings in older archives suggested odd geothermal activity, but nothing conclusive. Still, something about it called to me. I rented a Jeep, packed enough gear for a week, and drove into the scorched emptiness. The ranger at the outpost was the first warning. Old guy, desert skin, face like driftwood. Didn't talk much at first, just stared at me while I filled out my solo permit. "You planning on camping near the crater?" he asked after a long pause. "That's the idea," I said, trying to keep it light. "That land breathes," he muttered. "Sometimes it dreams." I laughed, but he didn't, not even a smile. Just handed me my permit and said, "Don't dig. Don't listen. Don't stay past the third night." The first night wasn't terrible. It was hot, of course. Still, heavy, but manageable. I pitched my tent near the southern edge of the crater and got some decent soil samples before the sun dropped behind the cliffs. The moon rose fast and full, casting everything in silver light. And then, silence. Not quiet. Silence. The kind that doesn't feel natural, like the whole world was holding its breath. No wind, no crickets, no distant coyote. Just a pressing stillness that made the skin on my neck crawl. Then I heard it. A deep, slow inhale, like something massive was lying far beneath the ground, breathing in through layers of ash and stone. I crouched at the edge of the crater, held my breath, and listened. I thought I was imagining it. But the sand under my boots shifted, just slightly, as though something stirred. I told myself it was heat playing tricks on my ears. I crawled into the tent and forced myself to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, something was wrong. My watch was corroded, its face cracked, hands frozen. My geology hammer, left clean and polished on a rock nearby, was now covered in a thick layer of orange rust. Even my metal tent poles were bending, warping. But the worst part? My hands. My palms were carved, literally etched with spiraling symbols, ancient looking, burnt into my skin with no sign of blood or healing, just smooth, blackened skin that throbbed with heat whenever I got near the crater. I ran to my laptop, tried to call out, email, anything, but the computer was fried. The solar charger was twisted like it had been microwaved. I should have packed up, should have driven out and never looked back. But instead, like a fool, I started digging. About a mile from camp, I found the fissure. It hadn't been there the day before, I was sure of it. A jagged crack in the earth, leading down at a sharp angle into total blackness. The rock around it was different, smooth, shiny, obsidian, but not like anything I'd seen. It pulsed faintly, like it was alive. I left a rope and flashlight above, then climbed in. The passage narrowed, twisted, then opened wide, into a hidden chamber buried under the desert. My flashlight flickered in the damp air. The walls were lined with something that looked like carved bone, but it was the things at the center of the chamber that made my blood go cold. Sarcophagi, maybe a dozen, maybe more. Tall, thin, impossibly black, like monoliths carved from the night sky itself, each one sealed with bands of aged copper and etched with the same symbols I'd found on my palms. I stepped closer to one with a crack in its lid. Inside wasn't a skeleton. It wasn't even solid. It was liquid. A thick, churning mass of black sludge, darker than pitch, shifting and twitching like it was trying to remember how to become something. It moved when I leaned closer, followed me, reacted. I ran. Back at camp, the heat was unbearable. The ground trembled, softly but steadily. My tent had collapsed. The shadows felt longer than they should have been. I tried the Jeep. Nothing. Battery dead. Dashboard warped. The gas in the tank had turned to black slush. I walked. For hours. Maybe days. The sun never moved right. The stars spun too fast. Sometimes I'd hear the desert humming, a song made of stone and ash. My dreams were full of spirals. Cities buried deep under the crust, with towers made of bone and fire, and creatures without eyes, who lived before the sky was born. The desert, I realized, wasn't land. It was a shell. Something unimaginably old was buried beneath us, not dead, not dormant, just asleep. And the crater? It wasn't a volcano. It was a wound. They found me crawling along the salt flats near Badwater Basin, sunburned, dehydrated, half-conscious. They said I'd been gone 12 days. I only remember 4. At the hospital, I tried to explain. They nodded politely, gave me pills, told me to rest. But I know what I saw. And even now, back in my apartment, I hear it. The hum, the breath, the desert's lullaby. Sometimes I wake up with sand in my mouth. My scars glow under moonlight. And when I close my eyes, I see the black liquid again, twisting, growing, learning. Something is waking up under Death Valley, and it knows my name. Theo Liang wasn't just a podcaster. He was an archivist of the strange. His voice, calm and intelligent, had carried across headphones to thousands of listeners who clung to every word. He had a natural way of making you believe, of pulling you in, like a whisper through a cracked door. But by the time he started the Chinatown project, something in him had shifted. His voice in the later episodes, it shook, like he was afraid, or maybe already marked. It started when he interviewed May, a fourth-generation Chinese American who ran an antique bookstore on Clay Street. She told him of the old stories, the ones grandmothers passed down in rushed, low Mandarin while burning incense they didn't understand. Stories of the deep listeners, of footsteps in the tunnels that never echoed right, of bells that rang in your dreams, leading you downward. May's own grandfather vanished in 1938. She kept the police report in a frame behind the counter. No body, just a torn sleeve, and a faint chime that had lingered for hours after he went missing. Theo was hooked. He always chased legends. But this wasn't like the ghost stories in Maine or the cryptid lore of Appalachia. This felt alive, like it didn't want to be found, but would reach for you if you looked too long. So he did what he always did. He dug, too deep. Hidden behind a crumbling noodle shop, past dumpsters and steam vents, stood a boarded-up herbal store. No sign, no windows, no digital record. Not even the landlord could remember who had last leased the space. Theo broke in at 2:14 a.m. He filmed everything, narrated in real time with his flashlight beam bouncing off dusty shelves, jars full of dried animal parts, brittle scrolls that disintegrated when touched. Then he found it. The back room. Empty, except for a cracked floor tile that sounded hollow when stepped on. He peeled it back and found a trapdoor sealed with rusted bolts and engraved in a symbol that defied logic. It wasn't Chinese. It wasn't any language he'd seen. It was alive. Its lines shifted when you looked at them too long, like trying to focus on something under murky water. He said in the recording, "I'm opening it. God help me." The trapdoor creaked like it hadn't been moved in 100 years. A cold gust poured out, like the air had been waiting. And then, the bells. Software. Distant. Beckoning. The stairs were steep, slick with moisture that shouldn't exist underground. His flashlight dimmed every 10 steps, flickering as though reacting to something unseen. Theo's breath fogged, not from cold, but from something wrong in the air, like it wasn't meant for lungs. The passage twisted, curved, dipped lower than he thought possible. Hours passed. His watch glitched, stuck at 3:19 a.m., no matter how long he walked. At last, he reached a chamber that defied architecture. Stone columns, black, jagged, reaching up into a ceiling hidden in darkness. The walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing. The bells were louder now, but they weren't ringing. Not really. They were speaking, not in words, not even in sound, but in meaning. Ideas pressing into his brain, thoughts he didn't want, thoughts he couldn't unthink. That's when he found the door. A great slab of obsidian, taller than a man, carved with the same crawling glyph from the trapdoor. It had no handle, no hinges, but it vibrated, like a drumbeat just below hearing. He approached it, whispered, "What are you?" It whispered back. Not in words, but in visions. He saw a time before humans, before anything that breathed. San Francisco was once a shallow bay, ringed by black stone towers not built, but grown from beneath. Something ancient had lived here, far beneath the crust, feeding on dark matter, tunneling through space between stars. It wasn't a god, not exactly, but it was aware. It had rules, and one of those rules was that no light should reach its eyes again. The cult had come later, drawn by dreams, by whispers in root cellars and basements. They built tunnels not to protect themselves, but to bind the surface, to keep that thing sleeping. And every so often, they needed someone new to listen, someone to carry its thoughts back into the waking world. The silent ones, their mouths sealed shut, their ears carved open. They lived in the deep now, listening, always listening, waiting for the signal to rise. Theo understood all this in a blink that lasted forever. He returned to the surface, but he wasn't the same. Neighbors said he looked thinner, pale, eyes too wide, like he was trying to see something just out of frame. He barely slept. He stopped eating. All he did was sit in front of his mic. And one night, he uploaded his final post. It was titled, "Below the Sigil." 33 minutes of silence, followed by a low hum. Then, chanting. The same from the catacombs. Rhythmic, wet, crawling. But if you listened with headphones, it changed. You'd hear your own name. You'd hear footsteps behind you. You'd hear the bells. Some say the audio mutates every time it's played. That no two recordings are the same. That some listeners start drawing spirals on their walls. That one man carved the sigil into his chest and disappeared into the sewer system. Theo hasn't been seen since. But sometimes, on quiet nights in Chinatown, you can hear the faint chime of bells from the drains. And if you lean in close enough, you might just hear them whisper your name. Mount Shasta was always more than just a mountain. Rising above the mist-choked forests of Northern California, it stood like a forgotten god, its snowy peak piercing the sky, its base tangled with myth. Locals spoke in hushed tones of strange lights at night, of humming in the earth, of a people called the Lemurians, who lived in vast cities beneath the rock. But no one believed that nonsense anymore. No one except us. We were 6 in total, weekend spelunkers and amateur geologists, bonded by beers, gear, and bad decisions. We met online, shared footage, mapped out lava tubes. It was just a hobby, a thrill. But in late autumn of last year, we heard about the new tube. A seismic shift had cracked open a fresh crevice just north of Panther Meadows. It was unmapped, unentered, unknown, exactly our kind of trip. So we went. We entered the fissure at dawn, GoPros mounted, ropes secure. The temperature dropped by 10 degrees the second we passed the threshold. The air buzzed faintly, like standing too close to a live wire. The tube sloped downward, a jagged throat swallowing us whole. After a quarter mile, the rock changed. Volcanic basalt gave way to a smooth veined stone we didn't recognize, greenish, soft to the touch, almost pulsing. No wildlife, no moss, just silence. And then, just after the first mile, the audio glitches started. Reviewing the footage later, what little survived, there were bursts of distortion, human voices, warped and slowed to a crawl, like speech played backward at the bottom of a well. Whispered syllables riding beneath the sound of our boots crunching gravel, and a low droning that didn't match anything mechanical, like a choir breathing in unison. We found the chamber 3 hours in. It wasn't natural. A dome-shaped cavern, perfectly round, walls covered in glyphs that hurt to look at, spirals within spirals, branching lines that shimmered when you turned away. And in the center, an altar, or perhaps a throne, stone blacker than night, shaped for a being too tall, too thin, with 6-fingered hands and a skull that stretched back like a coiled serpent's. We stopped filming, not because we were scared, though we were, but because something in the room didn't want to be seen. You could feel it, like the stone itself disapproved of light, like the cavern knew our names. And that's when Ben touched the glyphs. He screamed, dropped his flashlight, said the lines were moving, crawling up his skin. We laughed, nervously, tried to play it off. But then the ground trembled, just a pulse, like a massive heartbeat beneath our feet. The droning returned, louder now, shaking the walls. And the air, it got thick, like trying to breathe water. That's when we saw the first of them. They came from cracks we hadn't noticed, long slits in the wall that opened like gills. Tall, thin shapes slid out, walking wrong, like joints moved in reverse. Their eyes were black pits. Their fingers? Too many. Always twitching, always reaching. We ran, back through the tunnel, lights flickering, the rock shifting behind us, closing the path. But something had changed. The tunnel was longer, or maybe time didn't work right down there. Some said they saw stars in the ceiling, like the cave was opening into space. Ben was the first to vanish. One moment he was running behind me, screaming. The next, gone. No echo, no footsteps. Just silence. Then Kayla fell. The footage shows her sinking, not falling, like the ground had become liquid. She didn't scream, just stared upward as something pulled her by the spine. By the time I made it out, only 3 of us were left. Only one of us truly escaped. Mason. They found him wandering near the tree line 3 days later, barefoot, his eyes burned white, lips cracked, skin covered in scratches shaped like script. He couldn't speak at first, just muttered, over and over. "It drinks the dream blood. It eats the things we forget." He spoke later of a lightless city beneath the crust, where the children of Shub writhed in temples built before Earth had a moon. He said the caves were just arteries, and the mountain a skull, the fossil of a being that had once floated between dimensions, and that it wasn't dead, only sleeping, and we'd knocked too hard. He died that night. Heart attack, the coroner said. But I saw the video he took before he went catatonic, footage he'd never uploaded. One still frame showed something behind him in the tunnel, something tall, pale, watching, and smiling. We tried to find the cave again, brought back drones, hired a team, used satellite maps and Mason's GPS data. Nothing. The crevice was gone, covered in rockslide, they said, sealed. As if the earth itself had closed the wound, as if it regretted letting us in. Now, sometimes at night, I hear the humming again. Low, familiar, like the mountain is remembering me. Sometimes I dream of 6-fingered hands pulling me through my bedsheets, and in those dreams, I laugh, because I know they're waiting,